Dr. Wallace, thanks for joining us. It says on the notes here that contain the questions we're going to ask, it says, can you believe it's flu season again? That's the title. So,
Yeah.
Can you believe it's flu season again? And the question is, when does flu season actually start?
Well, until last year, the flu season was fairly standard in terms of, at least in this geographic area, it usually started late in the fall and lasted into early springtime. And so the vaccines were generally made so that you could get them before the season really started. But last year, because we had a new strain of flu.
You're talking about 2009.
Right. A new strain of flu that very few people had seen before. We didn't have a season. It just lasted from the time it first appeared, and it's still occurring.
Okay.
Not as much as it was before, but so it kind of disrupted all of our concepts of seasonality. But at least in general, the new flus in this part of the hemisphere usually begins in the fall and lasts till the spring.
Well, you mentioned new flus, which probably leads well into our second question. Why do I have to get a different flu shot every year?
There are three basic varieties of influenza. One resides in pigs, one resides in chickens, and one resides in people. And it turns out that human influenza can survive not that well in birds, but can survive very well in pigs. So what happens is you have populations of pigs with different influenza strains. The influenza strains get together, change their genetic parts, and so by next season, we almost invariably have a new flu strain with new parts because of what went on in the off-season in other hosts.
If I get the shot early now, which you're starting to see in the drugstores it's available, you're starting to see it promoted, will it last until the end of the flu season you described earlier?
Yes. The main reasons that we get an influenza shot every year is because the flu changes so that the protective proteins you made in your body that protect you against the viruses that are in the vaccine are no longer there. They're different. So each year you have to get new sets of proteins we call antibodies to protect yourself. So generally the vaccine will last for a number of years. Remember we said that those adults that had been exposed to swine flu 40, 50 years ago still had some partial protection many years later. So the reason you have to change is because the virus has changed. The timing this year also may be different. We usually say get your flu shot in September or get your flu shot when it becomes available, which was usually in September. The epidemic flu changed things around, and it's possible that beginning this month, we're going to start seeing influenza. So probably the earlier the better, which is when you start hearing the hospitals and the pharmacies advertise, go ahead and get your shot.
Last year, you mentioned 2009, all in the headlines, the H1N1 virus. Some people called it the swine flu. Are we going to deal with that whole subject again this year, 2010?
We are, but it's going to be a little bit easier, meaning the swine flu appeared after last year's vaccine had already been prepared. So in order to protect individuals, we had to make another vaccine. So you had a vaccine for what we call seasonal flu. That's the one that comes every year in the fall and the spring. But we also had to do it for this epidemic flu, whose parts often came largely from, people didn't want to call it the swine flu. They want to call it epidemic flu because it upset the farmers, and it sounded like their pigs were responsible, and so they've changed it around. But anyway, it was primarily swine flu. We had to have a second vaccine. This year's vaccine will contain that vaccine, the epidemic vaccine, the H1N1, as well as standard vaccines that we get. One is against influenza A, and one is against influenza V. So this is a trivalent vaccine this year.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, unlike 2009, I won't have to get multiple flu shots. One shot will do it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. How is the flu virus spread? And if I'm exposed to the virus, how soon will I begin displaying symptoms and get sick?
Well, it's a respiratory virus, and we presume that people that cough and sneeze who have the illness then spread the virus. We don't think some viruses are spread by hand contact. We don't think that's very likely. So close contact with others or places of not so good ventilation, your kids, your grandkids all carry significant risk for getting the flu. We always say that the greatest bump in influenza cases is after Christmas when school starts again, because then you have fairly close population of young people, often at highest risk, who then take the disease home for their parents. So you guarantee some sort of clustering. The weather may have to do with it. It's colder, more kids in a close contact each other, and that clearly is a risk for picking up nasal sprays that might have occurred from somebody who sneezed or coughed.
We mentioned the seasonal flu as we differentiate it from the H1N1, so we'll keep kind of run two tracks here if that makes any sense. The seasonal flu, what are the symptoms?
The seasonal flu actually and H1N1 are not terribly different. It's a respiratory virus, so you would expect that, especially in adults and older children, it's a typical sore throat, runny nose, followed by sort of diffuse muscle aching. It's a little bit uncharacteristic for most other viruses. You may have some low-grade fever, and it usually occurs 2 to 7 days after exposure. In young children, it can manifest itself very differently. I remember when I was younger and I had 3 kids at home, and influenza B was running in the community. And I had one child who had fever to 104 and just lay on the floor. And no cough, no runny nose, no sore throat. I had another that had an incredibly sore throat, could barely talk, and that was it. That was the only symptom he had other than some low-grade fever. And then my wife and I had all the symptoms. Runny nose, sore throat, a little bit of cough, and we ached all over. So especially in young children, it may be manifested as even nausea and vomiting associated with fever can be a manifestation of the flu. But in adults and older children, they tend to be fairly classic for a respiratory virus.
Well, so having said that, how does the H1N1 virus differ? Can you tell them apart?
Clinically, we can't tell them apart in terms of symptoms, but we will say this, that the more severe disease in years past with seasonal virus largely depended on how much underlying disease you had. So someone with bad heart disease, bad lung disease, older, weaker, in nursing homes, were the greatest risk for getting very sick, getting pneumonia, and even dying. Younger people tended to be much healthier and had much less problem with it. The epidemic flu from last year, the so-called swine flu, was different because we have had a couple of periods when the swine flu was present in the United States and worldwide. Most older adults were alive when that occurred, so they have some partial immunity because it was conferred because they were around when that swine flu epidemic occurred. Younger people were not around, so this is their first time to ever be exposed to the epidemic flu. So in the past year, with the epidemic flu, kids got a lot sicker because they'd never been exposed to it. And we may had more hospitalizations and more serious episodes of influenza in the younger population than we did in the older population who were partially immune.